Thank you. Well, welcome. Welcome to PuppetConf. This is your first time. I see there's a lot of yellow lanyards. We're really happy to have you here. This is also my first time. I don't have my lanyard with me, but thank you for coming. I know there's a lot of talks this session in this slot, and so I appreciate that you're here. Like I said, my name is Kenaz, and I didn't realize I needed a quippy subtitle. So mine is from 0 to hero in 30 minutes. Working on, yeah, there we go. OK, 0 to hero. And this will be hopefully a good overview of what kind of integrations that we have with Azure today and help you get started. So like I mentioned, I work at Puppet. This is my contact information. If you are interested or need some more information and you have questions, feel free to email me or tweet at me. We'll have some time for question and answer at the end. Like Gary mentioned, I previously worked on the Azure team in the infrastructure as a service offering. So I guess that's why I'm here talking to you about this and why they think I'm qualified to do this. I think that the products actually work very complementarily together to give you a really good experience. So we'll explain a little bit what that means. Today, we'll cover leveraging the Azure Marketplace to start with and what we've done there, and smart facts and classification in terms of how you actually ensure that your Azure VM or your Azure environment is your Azure environment for Puppet, using native resources. And so this is talking a little bit about our module. And really putting those things together and really getting the most out of both Azure and Puppet together. So first, survey. How many people here are Azure users or have used Azure in the past? That's probably why you're here. How many of you use another cloud provider? And so that's what I expected. Yeah, I mean, the reality is that most people use multiple cloud providers. And so this is just really to help you learn about Azure, but we'll talk a little bit about more what that means. So the first question, why Azure? And I no longer work at Microsoft, so I no longer have to give you the hyperscale hybrid cloud pitch. And instead, I give a slightly different version of that. But the big thing for Azure is that it's really big. It's 30 regions, I think, now, including some of the trickier regions to actually pull up a data center in, things like Germany, countries like Germany, Australia, China. If you've ever tried to stand up a data center in those countries, you realize there's a lot different requirements than you might be traditionally used to in the United States. And Azure really helps you by already doing that legwork for you. It's really, really big in the sense of that each cluster that is in Azure has about 1,000 machines. And there can be anywhere between 1 and 50 different clusters in a single region. And there's however many regions. There's a lot of physical machines, and that's a lot of VMs. Second thing is that it's deep. And so everything from a shared core and 768 megabytes of memory, all the way up to the last thing that I shipped was a 32-core, 448 gigabyte machine that's just VMs. And that's how deep the space is if you need to vertically scale. But in addition to that, there are additional services, websites, logic apps, things like that enable you to offload the parts of management that you want to Azure, and the parts you want to bring in-house, you can do that as well. So the next question is, so why Puppet? If you haven't sort of answered this from a rudimentary level, then I don't know why you're here. But I guess the real question is why Puppet and Azure together? And I think there's a couple of important things to call out there. The first one is the exploding number of VMs. Now that anyone can create a VM in Azure, you suddenly have VMs popping up all over the place. If you listen to Luke's keynote this morning, and you've ever seen your Azure bill that comes at the end of the month, you know that you may not know where all those things came from. That is in part because of how easy it is now to get a VM. And because of that, you need something to be able to manage it. Puppet is, we believe, the best in class in configuration of managing your configuration on these machines, ensuring that they're running the things that you want to run on them. And whenever you don't, you can tear those down as well. Day 2 plus management, meaning that it's fine if you have an Azure Resource Manager template that spins all of this stuff up. But what happens on day 2? How do you ensure that those things are still the way that you thought they were? One of the last things I did was ship a SharePoint template in Azure Resource Manager. And what happens the next day after someone has gone in and messed with the SQL Server Always On settings? Are you able to actually get it back to the desired state that you were looking at? And then finally, like I mentioned, cross-platform, cross-cloud. We recognize that most people, whenever they're creating these VMs, are going to create them in multiple cloud providers, and we want to provide the one solution. We think Puppet is the one solution that helps you automate all of these different types of environments, knowing that that reality is true, that you have tons of different types of technologies that are all sort of commingling together, and you have to have a way to manage all of those things. So the first thing that we want to talk about is the Azure Marketplace and what kind of work we've done there. Today, I think last year we announced being able to actually deploy a Puppet Master in Azure, except there was a lot of manual configuration steps that were required, including setting up ports, including enabling setting up your username and password for the console. Now we've put all of that into an ARM template and shipped it into the Marketplace. It is running the 2016.1 version of Puppet. We're looking to update that here pretty soon. If you are not familiar with Puppet, or you're still learning, or your teams are learning, this is actually a really great resource. We have a test drive in Azure that basically spins up a Puppet Master in our subscription and enables someone to walk through a guided example, a guided tour of Puppet. And it's totally free. And you can pass it off to someone else, and they can try it. Before, if you're familiar with the Learning VM, and you're downloading it, it's in OVA format. So if you don't have VirtualBox and you just have Hyper-V, and you were trying to convert OVA to VHD, you might run into some problems. Now you don't have to worry about any of that. You can just deploy the test drive. So a typical Puppet Enterprise deployment looks like a Puppet Master. In this case, that Puppet Master is going to be running in Azure. And then you have a number of agents that you can connect to that. Those agents can live on premises and would be connecting to the master in Azure. Or you can actually connect an agent that is running in Azure. And so what's the best way to do that, specifically for Windows VMs? We also shipped a Puppet agent to do that. A Puppet agent extension to that. And what an extension is in Azure land is a little executable that runs at the end of provisioning that enables some functionality. In this case, it's installing the MSI, and you pass in the FQDN of the master, and it will go and make the certificate request back to the master and connect to it. So to demonstrate that, I have already a master that's set up. Let me see if. Can we pull up the laptop? Dance. I usually do these dances a lot whenever I'm waiting for Azure things to spin up. In this case, we're just waiting for the feed to go through. I'm going to do some prep work so that you have to wait so long whenever this thing actually comes up. But no, I'm looking to display the screen.
You are?
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Wonder what happened. Oh, there we go. Now, let's try. No. I'm not sure why. Mirror displays. Aha. There we go. Sweet. So this is my Azure environment. This is a Windows Server 2012 R2 data center machine. I'm just going to quickly provision this. Ooh, standing and typing and doing stuff is interesting. Okay, test. And then I'm going to pick a VM size that will hopefully boot faster so that we're not sitting around waiting for it. This is the running on premium storage. And I'm going to add the Puppet extension here. the next time we do a rev, it'll also come out of preview. And get my Puppet master. And then the only other thing that I'm going to configure is the network security group. This basically enables me to, I'm going to set up a website, so I'm going to need to add another inbound rule here for web. Sweet. So while this thing is spinning up, I'll show you exactly what it's doing. So I have a control repo set up and a Puppet master that has that code. And basically oh, that's really small. Let me make that bigger. Basically what this is, if you're familiar with the roles and profiles pattern, that's what this is. The roles and profiles pattern dictates how you basically organize your Puppet manifests. The roles being a business function or unit, such as a web server, a database server, something like that. And the profiles being the technology stacks that you're applying to those roles in order to make that a reality. In this case, my role is a web server, and it literally just does two things. One is it pulls the profile for the baseline. Wow. And then and then it pulls down the profile for the, is that me? I know, something super exciting is about to happen. Then it pulls down this website. And so the baseline is pretty simple. All it does is install a couple of Windows features, the web server feature and the ASP.NET. And then it stops the default website on IIS. This could be a security profile. This could be a number of security profiles that are all put together. That's really what the baseline is for. And then I have a very simple fourth coffee website. Surprised that Microsoft hasn't shipped maybe Contoso or something newer. But fourth coffee is still what we have for IIS. And it basically downloads it, unzips it, and then sets up the website using the community IIS module. So going back to my slides. Sweet. So in a real environment, we know that the configuration I showed before is more of a contrived environment. You might have already a Puppet master installed, and you have a number of agents that are connecting to it. You have a compile master that you're using for performance reasons, but in general, we tend to recommend that you put these compile masters relatively close geographically to the machines that are connecting to it for performance, for mainly performance. And in the same way, we've seen a lot of our customers actually deploy a second compile master in Azure for the exact same reason. And you have, those things are geographically located, hopefully in the same T2 spine, and they'll be able to connect back to that compile master fairly easily. The other thing, or now I wanted to shift a little bit and talk a little bit about classification. And so you might run into a problem where now that you have all these new VMs that are spinning up in Azure, how do you determine which ones are which? So if you have an application, you might say, oh, well, I only want that application to run on my on-premise machines and not in my Azure VMs. Or you might want to say exactly the opposite. And so you need a smart way to actually determine whether or not a VM is running in Azure or not. So while I was working on the Azure team, I worked with this guy named Craig Landis. He's like one of the smartest support engineers that I know. He wrote this script that's detecting whether or not a machine is an Azure virtual machine, which is super complex. Why does it do? It basically it sets up a DHCP client. It queries the DHCP server. It checks whether or not option 245 is returned. It does all these things that no one really thought that was very intuitive, but in the end, it is categorically an Azure VM. I have a much simpler version of that, which is to basically query the SMBIOS tag, asset tag, on the system enclosure. And that's actually how Microsoft always writes the same value to that. Obviously, this is a not foolproof way, but in order to do application deployments, things like that, this is generally true. And what this basically enables is me to, I stick this fact in my factsd directory, and then on every VM that comes up, it'll check and see whether or not it's running in Azure. So hopefully, I don't know if this VM is going to come up in time, because I think it takes, I'm not going to wait around for this. I'm just going to pull up the one I already did. So whoa, why is that so small? Let's try that again. That's small too. What happened? So after the VM comes up, it goes, installs the Puppet agent. It talks back to the Puppet master. It pulls down the IIS configuration, installs IIS on it. It installs the security baseline. And it'll install the IIS and the ASP, and then it'll actually copy the website down to the host and install Fourth Coffee. So what we end up getting, because we've already enabled the port in the portal, we can now see that the Fourth Coffee website's running. All right, so now going back to my presentation. So let's talk a little about native resources. So we shipped the Azure Module at the end, actually at PuppetConf this last year, and it was in an alpha state. We recently moved it to supported state, and since then, we've actually made a number of improvements. Today, the Azure Module does VMs for the most part, but with some of the new changes that we've recently added, we made some improvements to it. The first one being you can now specify that there's no public IP address for the VM. Previously, you had to have a public IP address, which after we talked to a couple customers, realized that most people don't want to put all of their VMs on the internet. So that's now an option. Another thing is that we enabled VM extensions, like I had mentioned, so you can now connect your Puppet master to the. Go ahead. Do you have a question?
Does the image have to be from the gallery, or can I use my own images?
It's only from the gallery at this point. Okay. Yeah, we're looking into custom images very soon. And what this enables you to do, this just, by itself is just a normal VM. But the benefit that you get from putting these things together with some other Puppet types is you can create a defined type for your VMs. So in this case, I have a Windows VM. And for any of your customers who are now requesting a Windows VM or a Linux VM or whatever, you can create a defined type for that in Azure, or you can even specify a dropdown to be in Azure, in AWS, and some other cloud provider. And for each one of those VMs, you can now specify you can have it automatically install a Puppet master and have it, or install a Puppet agent and talk back to the Puppet master. So now a definition for that becomes very simple. Just basically the resource group that you're wanting to deploy in, the name of the VM, the location, et cetera. The other thing that we introduced in this updated release that is going to be shipping in 2 weeks or so are support for resource manager groups and resource manager storage accounts. So in the same way, you can now deploy these things as native Puppet types. The last thing I wanted to talk about on this is the support for Azure Resource Manager templates. So if you're not familiar, a Resource Manager template is basically a JSON description of all of your resources in Azure. This is an example of just deploying a public IP address. But now you can do the same thing in Puppet and actually pass the source URI of the template and the parameters below, and it'll deploy that, that whole unit into Azure. And so we realized that a lot of people, after writing Resource Manager templates, have now a tested unit of deployment that they're actually trying to, they want to keep it together. I mean, that's what they tested. So we realized that and want to enable you to be able to run these templates in Azure. That's why we offered this resource. And here's an example of a defined type that might wrap that. And so if you have, say, a 3-tier web application that is bundled in this template, now you can just deploy or define that as a defined type and bundle all of that together as one deployment. So at this point, you might be asking, like, so what? I mean, these are all sort of basic functionalities that you get whether you're on-premise or whether you're in Azure. Spinning up a VM is nothing new. So what is actually sort of the true value of running these things, of running Puppet and Azure together? So to demonstrate that, I'm going to do the demo first, because sometimes these things take a while to get moving. But basically what I have is something called a VM scale set. And a VM scale set is very similar to, if you're familiar with auto-scaling groups in AWS, it is a logical construct that basically allows VMs to spin up and spin down based on a certain threshold that it's monitoring. In this case, I have an Azure Resource Manager template that spins up a number of VMs, and then it'll have those connect back to the Puppet Master. So in order to test this, I'm going to run a tool that I use called Artillery that basically will create a synthetic workload that sends a bunch of requests to the VMSS website that I've created previously, and will hopefully cause something interesting to happen. So let's do this. So now this thing is running, and we'll just wait for it. Hopefully this thing will come up. So what's happening under the covers? I have my Puppet Master in Azure, as I mentioned. I have a VM scale set that I'm creating. We know that website load is not static. It keeps on going up and down. Say this Fourth Coffee website happened to get featured on Oprah, and now suddenly it blows up and you need like a ton more instances. You want the infrastructure that's supporting these things to be able to scale up and scale down relative to the load. So under the covers, like I mentioned, first it detects, the Azure environment detects that the CPU threshold has been reached. In this case, I've specified that as 30%, something very small. The next thing is that it triggers an auto-scaling event to say, hey, I need to add new VMs to this auto-scaling pool. It'll create that new VM with the Puppet agent pre-installed on it through the extensions that we shipped. It'll then talk back to the Puppet Master, pull down its IIS configuration from the PE master, and then add that VM to the load balance set so that it can handle now the scale. So hopefully this thing will show that. Let me go back to my portal. And we can see that I now have 3 instances running because the VM has, it recognized that there's a ton of people trying to hit this website, that I then needed to increase the number of instances. And so now it increased the number of VMs that we have to be able to handle that load. Woo, glad that worked. So finally, just a little bit about what's coming next. So we're going to update the Azure image to 2016.4. We're going to hopefully enable a paid offering here in the future that enables you to pay per node hour rather than just BYOL. An updated Azure extension to hook into some of the improvements that we actually made in 2016.4 are being able to pass trusted facts as CSR attributes to be able to do some interesting or more interesting smart auto signing. Those things are going to be prepackaged back into the Azure extension and shipped. And then finally, we're going to release those updates that I mentioned to the Azure Module and make sure that you can now deploy resource groups, extensions, and other things. So here's an appendix of all of the things. I'm going to post these all onto my GitHub repository. For more information, you can email me. You can tweet at me. Thanks for coming. Like I mentioned, I know there's a lot of great talks, so I appreciate you coming to this one. So, questions?
So if you have questions, raise your hand, and we'll get you on.
Oh.
So for the Azure extensions, our guys are using ARM to just like have the straight JSON.
Yeah.
Is there any documentation of like the version number or more documentation on how to do it that way?
Of
the agent version to use. So
Oh, okay.
like when we were using the preview, it was a much older agent.
Yeah. So our goal is to once we have new agents to push them out to Azure as quickly as possible. We just created this new team in Puppet called Cloud and Future Tech. And the goal of that team is to get all these marketplace artifacts updated at a regular cadence. And so part of that is building out CI infrastructure for that, building out automated pipelines for artifact creation. And when we do that, we can then push out those versions to Azure a lot faster. So hopefully the Azure extension that you use will always be the latest version. And if you can now, because of this, the work that we've done in this last release, you can now call in a simplified installer from the master for Windows, which you couldn't before. So if you need a specific version, you can do it that way too. I think there was a question
Another
right
question?
up here. Yeah.
I actually have a couple of them for you.
Okay, go ahead.
One was you showed how you could use the new resource that you have inside of there to pull up templates, the ARM templates.
Yep.
And I'm trying to see the value in that. Is that just for adding extensions, or can you go beyond that? Because like right now, I'm using the ARM to actually build the server, define all of the values, data disks, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And then I'm doing the rest through a DSC, and the server's already in that defined state. I want to move it to Puppet,
Yeah.
but I'm trying to get to the point where I can see this all happening there, and I'm still kind of not seeing it all.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, there's really what we see the resource template deployment as is a way to deploy an artifact that you've tested. And in this case, that atomic unit that you're testing is the resource group template. So we don't want to, in the same way that we offer a PowerShell resource that enables you to run PowerShell scripts arbitrarily, the reason for that is because we know in most production environments, you're not able to take everything and immediately throw it into Puppet code. That there's going to be a process. And part of that process is deconstructing those PowerShell scripts into just the parts that need to be PowerShell, that need to be written idempotently in PowerShell, and the things that you can then move into Puppet. And in the same way for Azure Resource Manager template, you should be able to, if you already have these things, we don't want you to say, oh, well, you have to change everything to run it on Puppet. We want you to be able to deploy that artifact that as is, and over time, move it more into Puppet or into basically break down that template into Puppet resources.
I guess where I'm going is like, on your original build with your ARM template, you're already defining things like storage accounts and things like that.
Yeah.
So what is what do you get from having Puppet do that after it's already defined because the server's already built? Because Puppet can't do it until the server's built.
Yeah. I mean, in that case, you would have Puppet be the thing that operationally manages those resources after they're created, and you would use ARM templates to actually do the deployment.
Okay. One more question.
Sure.
This might be more on Microsoft. You used to work there, so you might have an answer.
No worries.
Obviously, we've got a lot of different VNets.
Yeah.
VNets can't talk to each other. I don't want to have a puppet master in every VNet, and I don't want to route across the internet.
Yeah.
VNet peering is still in beta. I mean, do you have any ideas around how other people are handling that, or?
Yeah, I mean, so, and you don't want to set up like a site-to-site VPN?
Through to each VNet?
Yeah.
Could.
You could. I mean, and so what typically we see is that people have a separate Azure environment, and they'll have a separate Azure master and connect their Azure VMs to that master, and they're just isolated.
Okay.
The way they deploy to those masters is through Git, right? Like they'll use Git as the central control thing to push out different pieces of code to different masters.
Okay. One last one. I'm sorry.
No,
Just want to be
go
quick.
ahead.
Do you have any sort of timetable or any thoughts around when you will allow custom images? Because that's pretty important to us. Because we bake a lot of stuff in there, and it
Got it.
literally shaves off about a half hour on server build time.
No promises. I will definitely take that into consideration, put it into the feature queue.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Other questions?
Great.
Great.
Well,
So
thank you. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you.